the audience around the world. Befitting the title of the book, we have a truly global audience here with us, spanning across more than 20 countries, nearly 50 cities. Not surprisingly, nearly a quarter of the people who registered for this event came from Oxford and Washington, DC. So a big shout out to the latter group for waking up early to get a glimpse of the old friend. My name is Deepak Mishra. I am the Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER. It gives me immense pleasure to warmly welcome everyone to this book launch event by one of India's finest economists, policymakers, and columnist, Dr. Shankar Acharya, and his book, An Economist at Home and Abroad. When Dr. Acharya gave ICRIER the first right of refusal to launch this book, we grabbed the opportunity with both our hands. Dr. Acharya may be best known as the longest serving chief economic advisor to three well-known finance ministers, Mr. Manmohan Singh, Mr. Chidambaram, and Mr. Yashwant Sinha. But for us, he's most intimately known as one of the longest serving honorary professors at ICRIER. It is therefore a huge honor and a great pleasure for us to host this event, especially in a year when ICRIER is also celebrating its 40th years of anniversary. One of the perks of organizing a book launch is to receive an advance copy of the book. My copy arrived just before India's Independence Day weekend, and I put the long weekend to good use. If you are a budding economist or somebody who is in policy making or generally interested in India's economic development, past, present, or future, this is a must-read book for you. You'll find the book gripping, riveting, wonderful, delightful, and lucid, which is exactly how Dr. Venugopal Reddy, Mr. Martin Wolf, Mr. Uday Kotak, Mr. Montek Singh Aluwalia, and Mr. T.N. Nayanan have described it while paying their tribute. In my view, the book brings three aspects of Shankar's life, only one of which is well known to most of us. While getting to know the other two would require you to buy the book and to read it, and I'm not at liberty to reveal you a lot, but let me give you a few snippets. First, Shankar the Economist. I've always admired Shankar's articulate, balanced, and non-partisan perspective on Indian economy. The book does not disappoint. He speaks unequivocally about his experience with the three finance ministers, their style, policy, and substance, as well as those who succeeded them. In my view, with this book, Shankar has cemented his reputation as one of the few economists in India who continue to speak and write without fear and favor. Second, Shankar the Socialites. Having known Shankar only in his professional capacity, I had no clue how socially connected he is. From prime ministers to Bollywood celebrities to corporate executives, many of them seems to be on Shankar's speed dial. After reading Shankar's book, the mythical story that Mr. Satyajit Ray wanted to cast Shankar as a child actor in one of his movies doesn't sound that mythical anymore. Finally, Shankar the family man. Nearly a third of the book is devoted to Shankar's family, friends, and even his family pets. Despite a demanding career, Shankar never lost contact with his close friends and colleagues. And so it's not a coincidence that for tonight's event, we have three of Shankar's closest friends and colleagues in the panel. Mr. Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economic Commentator at Financial Times, who knows Shankar from his time at the World Bank. Mr. Nandakishore Singh, a prominent Indian economist, academician, policymaker par excellence, and the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, who and Shankar worked closely at the Ministry of Finance throughout the 1990s. And Mr. Ashok Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of Business Standard, the newspaper that has been publishing Shankar's weekly column for nearly 2 decades. Before we go to the panelists, let me thank Harper Collins for co-hosting this event with us. And with that, let me welcome Ms. Shatarupa Ghoshal, who I understand was in the kitchen and personally overseen the book being cooked, to invite her to share her views on all the work that has gone behind the scene and which are very critical to the success of the book. So with that, let me thank you for your attention and pass the mic to Shatarupa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. We are very, very happy at HarperCollins to have published this book. It's been really, really great working with Dr. Acharya. I've been in publishing for a long time, and not all authors are as gracious, as kind, as uh, collaborative and understanding of the process as Dr. Acharya has been. And you've already spoken about how varied the book is, how amazingly it covers all aspects of his life. And what really impressed me was, as we were discussing, as was being discussed earlier, is how incredibly detailed he has managed to make it, and how even though it's obviously stories go back some 50, 60 years ago, they're all so incredibly detailed. And we're very, very happy, and we really wish the book a lot of success, and we're hoping it will do really well. So thank you.
Thank you, Shatarupa. Now, can I pass on the floor to Ashok, Mr. Bhattacharya, to moderate the event?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Can I, Deepak, since you allowed, or at least Ashok was saying butting in is possible, I just want to say thank you to you, Deepak, for your very gracious introductory remarks. Very, very, how shall I say, unjustifiably complimentary to me, of course, but I truly appreciate them. And once again, Shatarupa, it was a pleasure working with you, and thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya.
Ashok. Back to you, Ashok.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mishra. Thank you, Dr. Acharya. Welcome once again. As a moderator now, I have the privilege of announcing that we now go into discussion of the book by Dr. Acharya. And to do that, we of course have Dr. Acharya himself, but equally important, we have two other discussants, Mr. Martin Wolf and Mr. N.K. Singh. None of them really needs an introduction here. Mr. Wolf is an internationally acclaimed commentator with his pieces regularly appearing in the Financial Times. And Mr. Singh is a well-regarded economic administrator who was the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission and has just been appointed as the president of the Institute of Economic Growth. More importantly, both of them appear in Dr. Acharya's memoirs in many places. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, and thank you, Mr. Singh, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Acharya, for being part of this discussion. I intend to spend the next hour or so in the following way. After my opening remarks, I go over to my panelists, requesting them to make their opening comments for about 5 minutes each. After this, we will have a question-answer session with each of them, starting with the author, and then take some questions from the participants. For those of you who may not have yet read the book, An Economist at Home and Abroad, A Personal Journey, let me do a quick recap. Thematically, the book can be divided into 4 clear segments: his personal life, his interactions with an assessment of the government, and in particular, as many as 4 finance ministers in a span of 15 years, his life as the chairman of a bank, and his take on the state of the Indian economy and its prospects. An interesting and appealing feature of his book is that in his narrative, he lets the personal to be interspersed with his work life. So how does Dr. Acharya look or appear on the pages of his book? Let me attempt at a portrayal with the help of his memoirs. As Dr. Mishra pointed out, here was a young boy who was offered a role to play the famous Apu in Satyajit Ray's first film. But the offer was turned down by his father because that would have distracted him from his studies. The same young boy left India when he was just 14 for his school education in England, from where he went off to the US for higher education, and then lived there for a World Bank job returning to India when he was 37 years old. During this long sojourn of 23 years, he made many friends. Aung San Suu Kyi, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Sunetra Bandanaike, Martin Wolf, to name just a few. He's also taught by Subramanian Swamy at Harvard, where thanks to Swamy's efforts and the author's academic performance, he gets a tuition waiver. He returns to India in 1982 to work for a think tank, produces a paper on black money, and advises against demonetization to tackle that menace. And even after more than 3 decades, the government of the day opts for demonetization to crack down on black money. Chance and circumstances play a big role in his life and work. He's almost packing up his bags to return to the World Bank in 1984, as the chances of his getting into the government as advisor look very remote. But the tragic assassination of Indira Gandhi changed all those equations. There is a new prime minister. There is a vacancy in the finance ministry for an economic advisor. The author stays back and helps produce the country's first long-term fiscal policy document. Disillusioned by the waning zeal for reforms after the departure of VP Singh as the finance minister, the author has to deal with finance ministers who had little interest in pushing reforms. As the economy deteriorates, he decides to get back to the World Bank in November 1990. He is, of course, back in New Delhi in April 1993 as the chief economic advisor, a stint that lasts for as long as 8 years. He has to work with 3 finance ministers, all of them talented, but one of them a little arrogant. Obviously, he finds Manmohan Singh the best, followed by Yashwant Sinha. But he gives more credit to Vajpayee's government for the reforms than even Rao's government. At the end of 8 years, he decides to take a break from a government job and does not consider an offer from the government in 2014. He reinvents himself as a successful policy commentator in newspapers and other periodicals, and dons a new role as the chairman of a highly successful private sector bank. He worries about the Indian economy and its prospects of growth. He's often proved right. He now projects a moderate growth rate in the medium term, which is a cause for concern. That roughly is the story that Dr. Acharya narrates in this book. Clearly, that's a rich offering and an even more engaging subject for discussion today. With this brief portrayal of sorts, let me turn to you, Dr. Acharya. Please make your opening comments, and also, if you can, answer my question. As a writer, what was more interesting to you, writing about your life abroad or about your various jobs and assignments in India? Dr. Acharya.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ashok, for that brilliant summary of my book. Now, nobody needs to buy it, though. So, I mean, you've destroyed the market at one fell swoop. So that's
there is much more there. There is much more there.
No, but thank you very much. It always helps to know roughly what's in the book, and you've done that very well indeed. So, sorry, I'm bad at remembering. Your first question, please, again.
No, I was saying is that, I mean, please make your opening comments, whatever you wish to make. Okay. But in addition, I would like you to answer this specific question, that as a writer, what was more interesting to you, writing about your life abroad or about your various jobs and assignments in India?
Okay, thank you, Ashok. Let me try and respond. Well, first of all, you know, I had never set out to write an autobiography. And I think any one factor is either responsible or should get credit. It's the pandemic and the associated lockdown that started last year. And essentially, you know, there's only so much Netflix you can watch and things like that. And so I started to move from the sofa to the desk where I could be at my computer. I have to say that various people had suggested to me that I try and attempt something at some point, or as rather at different points. And this seemed to be an ideal moment to do that, when one was essentially under house arrest in one's flat and had nowhere to go. When I started, I also had I genuinely didn't have any intention of publication. I was writing essentially for my close family, close relatives, and close friends. I thought it'd be nice to have a document which I could share with them and leave for posterity with them. And so I began writing chapter by chapter, pretty in a disciplined way, 3-4 hours a day. And, I found the act of remembering and sharing and getting the feedback very rewarding. And by about halfway through, I was getting a lot of pressure to say, look, don't just confine yourself to us dozen people you're circulating chapters to, but think of publishing a book. And that's why I finally ended up burdening people like Shatarupa with this task of a manuscript to deal with, and the folk at HarperCollins were very kind to accept my proposal to do a book. So that's how the book originated. I think a couple of you have already commented about the mixture of the personal and the professional in this memoir, which perhaps leans more heavily than usual to the personal. And I think that's partly the way it started, because it was meant to be a personal document which got transformed into being something else. And I have some trepidation on that score, because I don't know how the market will take it. We'll find out soon enough. And Shatarupa will tell me one day that people liked it, but that's it. Nobody else bought it. Could be, we don't know. But I think the question I had to answer in facing this issue of publication was, after all, everybody has a life, and everybody can write that up. But what might make it a little different and worth sharing from people I don't know? And I think 3 or 4 things that came to mind and sort of, if you like, emboldened me to go for publication. One, that I'd had a very varied childhood thanks to my parents of wandering the globe. Father was a diplomat and ambassador here, there, elsewhere. And so from the age of 13, 14, I was essentially, not just that my schooling was outside India, but also that schooling and college and postgraduate and so forth, but also that during the long vacations, I never came to India. I went to wherever they were. This could be Prague, this could be Rio, this could be Rabat, Morocco, this could be Ottawa, this could be Islamabad. In fact, they all were. So, of course, I got less of India as a result, but I got to see the world at a young age, got to see different cultures, different perspectives at a young age. And I thought sharing those perspectives might be something useful. Secondly, the other thing that I thought might be worth sharing is that even after I came back to India, and which was in 1982, essentially first on leave and then I resigned from the World Bank, I felt that perhaps a little out of the ordinary, I kind of did different jobs, if you like. I'd already done a decade or so in the World Bank before coming, as Ashok pointed out. But also that after coming, I did different things, think tanking, which has been going on for the last 20 years, and the first 2 that you mentioned when I wrote that Black Money report, Ashok. And then 15 years with the government, first as economic advisor, then as chief economic advisor, from roughly 1985 to roughly 2001. And then, of course, for 15 years with the board of Kotak Bank, 12 years as chair, corporate, bit of the corporate stuff. So again, different perspectives, different stories, different priorities, if you like, which I thought, well, certainly made my life interesting, but I thought sharing this with other people through reasonably coherently written book, I hope, would be of value. And then fourthly, if you like, or thirdly, something that again Ashok has touched on, despite all this travel and dislocation, if you like, it also gave me the opportunity to make some very good friends in different continents. You know, some of them may be here today. I mean, like Martin here, who's on the screen, or like Johannes Lynn, who I saw and had signed up, and there are others. And of course, they find their places in the book. And of course, at Oxford, I had the opportunity to have some rather interesting friends. You mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi, Monte Ahluwalia, Sunetra Bandanaike, whose family really dominated the first 2 decades or some 2 decades of Sri Lankan political life, and so forth. I don't have to name everybody. And I also, perhaps while I was at school, it's an unusual thing for a young boy from India to have done at that period, not so unusual now, you know, going to an English public school at the age of 13, when I first started, and being the only Indian in 600 boys was a challenge. But it gave me the great benefit of perhaps my oldest and closest friend, Michael Minton, who I'm not sure he's on this because I can't see all the names, but certainly we are still sort of very close and get together. So these are some of the things that I tried to share, and I've tried to be also as candid as I can reasonably be. There are obviously, there's no such thing as 100% candor when one writes an autobiography. In fact, there never is, perhaps. So let me leave it at that. You asked me which did I like writing better or more. You know, honestly, I don't think that there was a difference, because when I wrote chapter by chapter, I was immersed in that chapter. You know, this is trying to remember and engaging with my memories. So in a sense, of course, what has happened more recently is more vivid and easily capturable. And most of that is in India. Mm-hmm. And I think the way I would answer it perhaps is that before 82 and after 82 was a watershed, because coming back to India, re-engaging with India, left as a child, now a mid-30s adult, and having to deal with really what is a very different culture than from the West, in many ways, including the physical. That was a challenge not just to me, my wife, who, by the way, is the most important person I met in Oxford. I should say that before I get into trouble. So I think that was that whole business, in a sense, the return of the prodigal, was a theme that was very interesting in itself.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. Let me turn to Mr. Wolf and would request, may I request Mr. Wolf to make his opening comments? Mr. Wolf?
Yes. First of all, it's a great pleasure and an honor to have been invited. Shankar has, as we see from the book, very many distinguished friends. I don't quite know why I'm on this panel. I'd like to divide what I have to say in, I've got about 5 minutes, so it'll be very truncated into 3 parts. First, my personal friendship, which is discussed here and which links with his career in Washington. I actually met Shankar, I think, in October 1971. So that means that it's almost exactly half a century. And at that stage, we were rather younger, and we were both married to really young and I think very beautiful women, great intelligence. And we have had the remarkable intelligence and capacity to stay married to these same women for more than half a century and to have remained friends throughout this period. I think the friendship is, to me, and with a few other Indian friends whom I met at exactly the same time, the most important of which, apart from Shankar, was Montek, because we all worked in the same division. We were all working with Stanley Please at the same time. And DC Rao, who I haven't seen so much recently, was also one of these people. And I became, and I'll come to that in the second part of what I say, a sort of honorary Indian. I thought of myself a little bit. And I worked with Shankar subsequently, not only in that division, but also on the first World Development Report, where I did the work on trade, and I worked as a consultant for the one he ran. So I had a professional engagement. The book, that's a second point I want to make. The book brings out, I think, perfectly what I think are quite extraordinary qualities, which I haven't met in anybody else in quite the same way. He manages to combine an extraordinary detachment intellectually, that is the ability to look at things and decide what he thinks without being too concerned what anyone else thinks, including the people he's working with. This detachment is very rare in intellectuals who are, in David Hume's famous phrase, usually slaves of the passions. And this goes along with, and this is really extraordinary, with an extraordinary personal engagement. He likes people. In fact, he loves people. And this is brought out to an extraordinary degree in this book. That combination of being almost icy intellectually, savaging his friends mercilessly, as he's been doing for years, while being so personally engaged, is extraordinary. And it comes out beautifully in the book, and I admire it. Now, the third thing I wanted to say is about India, and it fits in with the basic theme of the book on the economics, which is very clear. As the last thing I want to say, one of the few things Shankar misses in his account is that in 1974, as he said, he joined Stanley Please in the front office of the East Africa Department, which is correct. What he didn't say is that he replaced me, who had been doing that job before him. And he replaced me because I was just made the senior economist in the India division. And in that capacity, between 74 and 77, I worked on India for the World Bank during the first oil shock, which was a big shock. And I wrote all the papers on how India needed to be assisted through that period. And by the way, the governor of India's chief economic advisor at that period was Manmohan Singh, whom I got to know very young, very well. And the main conclusion I reached from this was that India's economic policy was simply mad, I'm afraid. And I wrote a book about it, published in 1982. And he brings this out. Basically, I think India lost about 20 years of potential growth. And this is one of the greatest, in my view, the greatest development tragedy of the post-war period. This is not trivial. As Shankar brings out, this changed in the 90s, essentially, under 3 finance ministers and 2 remarkable prime ministers. That was the decade of really good policy, and that continued to have an effect till, let's say, 2008-9. And since then, and I was completely wrong on this because I was more optimistic than him, things have been going downhill in performance and in policy, with a few exceptions which he lists. And that's the very last point I would make. His sobriety of judgment and assessment has always proved correct, in my view. He is far and away, and I mean this absolutely seriously, the best commentator on India anywhere, the only one I take really seriously, although there are a few others I take quite seriously. And his warnings at the end of the book are to be taken with absolute seriousness, because if he's right, and I'm sure he is, and the growth potential is around 5%, this is very bad news for the future of India.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. I will not let you go before asking a question that actually triggered by what Dr. Acharya referred to about his days in England, where he went to a school where he was the only Indian. And he does refer to racism in that environment, How would you know? You also have lived in that part of the world at that time. How would you be your assessment of that kind of a situation at that point in time?
Well, the interesting thing is, I was actually at school I thought this would take me some time. I was at a school very close to his at almost exactly the same time. I wasn't, of course, a boarder. It was a day school called University College School. And this may be wrong, I don't remember any Indian in that school at that time. And that might be wrong. And there was at that stage, we're talking about the 50s, very, very few non-white people in London. The first really large group were the Caribbeans who came towards the end of that decade. So looking back on it, it is extraordinary. It's not that, obviously, I'll come to this in a moment. I had no experience of this because I basically, what Shankar brings out, the rarity. I didn't see interaction between white people and brown people, as it were, brown, black, yellow, whatever you want. I hate these color descriptions, but never mind. Because in my life, there weren't any. However, there is an interesting vignette on this. Of course, racism, in my view, I'm afraid, racism is a pervasive feature of humanity. You can disagree with that. We can have a very long discussion of this. Now, I'm Jewish. And when I came along, there were quite a lot of Jews who wanted to go to my school. And there was a quota against Jews. Not much discussed. There was a quota against Jews because they were frightened, rather as they are in America now about East Asians, Chinese and so forth, that if they opened the school to Jews, they'd soon be flooded. And by the way, they did get rid of the quota, and they were quite right. Very soon, there were 30% of the school boys were Jewish. And they didn't really like it, but they got used to it. In the end, they decided that was fine. And I think that's sort of what's happening in the country more generally, but it's taken about half a century to get used to it. So that's my reaction to this story. Shankar's accounts seem to me completely compelling and convincing, but his experiences are not one that most of us would have recognized. To the honest truth, the first people I met who were of Indian origin were at Oxford, where I met quite a few, including Montague.
Thank you for this very detailed answer to this question. I will not let you go, but just one quick question. In your commentary on the book, which was published in the book, you mentioned that it is as a commentator on the Indian economy that he excels. He is the best. My question to you is that why do you think he is the best? And what are the qualities that you see in him that made him the best commentator, which I don't disagree with at all. He is the best commentator on economic policies in this country. So what are your reasons for calling him the best?
Well, I think, follows from what I said earlier. First of all, his knowledge of how the Indian economy works is quite obviously exceptional. That goes without saying after he spent so much of his life with such immense distinction doing this job, particularly as the chief economic advisor. So he knows the innards. And second, as I said, he follows the logic of the analysis and the data meticulously. He doesn't allow, and this is extraordinarily rare, by the way, and I'm very clear that I'm not as good at this as he is. But he follows the data and the analysis wherever it will lead. And if it ends up saying that people he's very close to are in power, or people he disagree have done things very wrong, or people he's not close to and in power and have actually done something right, he says so. But it is, he really calls it as he sees it. This is a product of intellectual and moral integrity. It's unbelievably rare in commentators of all kinds, as I said, who are slaves of the passion. And the result is he is more often right. Obviously, there's uncertainties. Nobody knew COVID was going to hit us in 2019. There are obviously things we don't get right. But his analysis, for example, of COVID in the book is stupendously good. How it affected India. It says everything that I thought, but so much better because he knows so much more. These are qualities which are exceptional in any commentator on any country I know. But I do read a fair amount of Indian commentary because I'm very interested in India. I know many of the economists who work on India. I think he's completely exceptional in that combination of abilities, and particularly the detachment from personal investment in the outcome of his analysis. That is a very rare and admirable quality.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Let me now turn to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, your opening comments on the book, please, Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Ashok. First, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it has been to go through this remarkable and brilliant autobiography. It's awesome in detail, in precision, in accuracy, and the entire architecture of his forays in policy making, including the details of his personal life, have been brought out in a manner which is quite extraordinary, even baffling, considering that he kept no notes. And as he told us how he embarked on this project. So it's such a rich account of the diverse life which he led. On the few comments which I want to make. First and foremost, Martin mentioned about his long years of affection. What struck me also, as far as I was concerned, apart from my own interactions with Shankar, is the great similarity in the life patterns of Shankar's father and my father, both members of the Indian civil service. While his father, who was allotted the Bengal cadre at that time, and my father, the Bihar cadre, his father moved over to the Indian Foreign Service and moved over to different destinations, which Shankar mentioned, which enabled him to really get a global view in some ways. He was the Deputy High Commissioner in East Pakistan, for instance, and saw Pakistan when it was part of the Greater Pakistan, to Prague, to Morocco, to Ottawa, ending up in Islamabad as from the Deputy High Commissioner, where he began, end up as a High Commissioner of India at a time when the emancipation of Bangladesh was just taking place. So in certain sense, this really gave Shankar such a bird's eye view about the entire global context. Also, I think the fact that we have shared many things earlier, apart from, I'll come to the finance ministry part, but outside the finance ministry, in representing India in GATT, in UNCTAD, in meetings with the World Bank, Nation Development Bank, including on track to diplomacy, at Stanford for the annual Stanford conference, at Neemrana for the annual Neemrana conference, so many multiple ways of commonalities and engagement. When I first, of course, however, came in contact with him in the Ministry of Finance, Shankar came in 1993. I had reached there in 1991. And therefore, to some extent, the contours of our arrangement with the International Monetary Fund and the structural adjustment loan with the World Bank was more or less completed at the time when Shankar joined. So since then, it has been a very, very fulfilling relationship, which goes back right from that time. Perhaps not as long as Martin's, but nearly as long. There are a couple of other things. For instance, most of us know the public offices that Shankar occupied. Few of us, unless you read the book, and I don't want to kill the market, few of us know of the public offices which he chose not to. For instance, he refused to be a deputy governor of the Reserve Bank, which he mentions on page 181. On page 205, he mentions how Dr. Manmohan Singh tried to persuade him to become a senior advisor in the PMO. And not many know that notwithstanding a change of governments, he mentions on page 235 of his book that he refused the offer from the principal secretary to be the chairman of the Narendra Modi's Economic Advisory Council, and thereafter the chairman of the BRICS Bank. It is quite extraordinary of that his self-effacing characteristics and his acute consciousness of whether he would be able to bring value to that responsibility and to add anything which was meaningful. There are few like Shankar who would give up happily so many other opportunities of holding public offices. I can think of no one. Having said this, there are a couple of observations, and one or two of it may be directed really at asking a question to Shankar. Shankar on page 151 of the book, you mention of a rather intriguing visit which you made to Washington under the instructions of the then Secretary Economic Affairs, Gopi Krishna Arora, along with Jagmohan Lal Bajaj, to find out really whether India was slipping and what could be really done. You came back, and the idea of having a safety net arrangement with the IMF in '89 was abandoned, and that I think proved somewhat costly. I wish you to comment on whether the obduracy of that time was such and are really resolved not to do anything on fiscal issues, which really triggered the beginnings of the 1991 economic crisis. In this sense, was it a failure not to catch signals in time, and that whether the 1991 crisis was really in that sense avoided? Second, the second question is a question that Martin has already asked. It has always proved very enigmatic to me. Why India delayed its economic reforms for as long as it did? Was it, in your view, Shankar, and I only hazard a guess, a hangover of a certain mindset of a socialist era, a distrust of private capital, private entrepreneurs, and we really did that when we had no other options left? Some commentary on why India was such a laggard. This is more or less the kind of question which Martin also suggested. The third, which comes to my mind, it has always tickled my mind, as you mentioned on page 164 of your book, that we prematurely, as we know, terminated the arrangement with the International Monetary Fund by not drawing down the last tranche. I wonder whether this was a blessing or a curse. I ask myself the question, had this arrangement continued with the multilateral institutions, would we have been prompted to finish the huge unfinished agenda? Did this early termination put us off track, considering the fact that in your own book, Shankar, you mentioned that the tenure of the UPA government, as far as economic reforms is concerned, in a sense, a decade, a wasted decade? Three more very quick observations. First, I fully underscore what you said in page 166 of your book, that the cohesiveness of the team in the Ministry of Finance of Montek, Venkataramanan, Rangarajan, Shivraman, myself, some of us, was really a very important guiding factor, and the importance of a cohesive approach. As we move forward, there are a couple of things, Shankar, which really attract me. First, I think that I have been quite struck by the importance which you have given to geopolitical factors. And when you were writing the book, the Afghanistan crisis had not rolled out, which only adds to geopolitical concerns. I fully agree with you that the tax, in terms of the tax GDP ratio, the expenditure on capital expenditure and defense really is abysmally low, and we need to do it. But here is the catch. Where are the consistent with the issues of overall financial stability? What is the fiscal space which is available for, unless you increase the tax GDP ratio, which has languished at 20%? Yes, there is an appetite now to make far-reaching changes in GST. The direct taxes, of course, continue to languish, but these far-reaching changes are necessary to give us 4 to 5% additional room of GDP for purposes of expenditure in areas which you rightly mentioned. You have also, as far as defense is concerned, mentioned about the Atmanirbhar, because really, given the uncertainty and given the fact that the defense industry has a multiplier effect on capital expenditure, fully has many multiple advantages. My last comment, Shankar, is that after careful reading, you have concluded that the current response of the government to the ongoing pandemic in some ways needs to be orchestrated further. But you recognize, for good reasons, that the fiscal space which is available is not only limited. When we entered the pandemic already, the FIS was quite high. The debt to GDP was quite high. Since I did my last FRBM report, the debt to GDP currently is over 90%, as Shankar currently points out. So in that sense of the term, I think that the response of a combination of monetary and fiscal factors would really have played itself out better than the kind of fiscal stimulus which many have really sought for. So as we go forward, I realize that there is a very difficult agenda. You have mentioned some very important reform initiatives which I have taken. And to come back to the point that Martin ends, it would, Martin, no doubt worry anyone interested in India's future if we continue to languish at 5%. But Shankar, being Shankar, has couched this 5% by a number of preceding caveats which he has undertaken, namely that if the reform initiatives currently which have been undertaken, he mentioned some of them on land, labor, capital, many other things, if they have a multiplier effect in terms of the actual productive efficiency, and I think there are leads and lags between reform and the GDP numbers, which we have seen in the past, that reforms undertaken in the 90s continued during the UPA period, the reforms undertaken by the Vajpayee period, to whom you have given deservedly very rich tributes as being a great reformer, that really benefits of that spilled over to the subsequent. The benefits of the current reforms are certainly going to spill over, and I do not share the view that if these reforms are really continued, we will languish at 5%. We will hope to come to what is India's potential growth, given all other factors. And what is potential is of course, doubtful, but it will certainly be much closer to India's potential, given the current momentum on these economic reforms. Finally, I think all I can say is that you have rightly pointed out, Shankar, that autobiographies are not encounters with truth, but this autobiography indeed is candid and in many ways an encounter with truth, any more than people could have hoped for. Thank you very much.
Dr. Acharya, I mean, you have many questions to answer. You can write another book, actually.
Do you want me to have a crack at some of them?
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, well, very, very quickly, and it will be unsatisfactory because it will be quick and short. It has to be, to give everybody time. But NK, of course, has, well, first of all, once again, thank you, NK. And thank you, Martin, before that, for your wonderful comments. And I really, Martin, felt very touched by everything you had to say. You didn't have questions, so that's why I didn't have to respond to anything. But NK, I also am very grateful to you for what you have said. As you know, you also said some very nice things earlier, which I deeply appreciate. Let me quickly turn to some of the questions. First, on the 1989 thing, which Gopi Arora set in motion, where I and the then Joint Secretary in charge of a fund bank, Jagmohan Bajaj, it was a sort of peculiar kind of semi-official trip where two of us basically went off to Washington and met with the director of the Asian department, Hubert Nice, and his colleagues, of course. And we tried to have something like a shadow program, which we could take back. And I think from their perspective, rightly, since we were probably at that time back up to about 8% of GDP, thereabouts, center states together, fiscal, if not higher, perhaps. I don't exactly remember the numbers. They were sort of looking for a solid 2% of GDP reduction in the first year, or something of that order. And, Bajaj and I felt this was unlikely, but we'll take the message back. And of course, when we got back, Gopi, Mr. Arora, who was then the finance secretary, said, look, there is no appetite for a fund program. I think the fund was still seen as a no-no at that time. The pressures on the balance of payments could still just about be managed. Remember at that time, the proximate trigger of 91 had not occurred, which was the war in the Mideast, which sent oil prices up and stuff like that. So it was managed. Combination of so-called hidden reserves, unconditional facilities with the IMF, getting our PSUs to borrow overseas short-term, oil companies in particular, and stuff like that. Not good policy in a sustainable way, but if you're in the hot seat of being the political executive, you want to avoid the painful stuff as long as you can. So I don't know whether I would call it obduracy or not, but I think it was the soft option. And of course, that particular government didn't last much longer for other reasons, perhaps. So you know what we all went through after that. Secondly, why was India such a laggard in embracing the fruits of globalization in the years when the fruits of globalization were really quite high, which they may not be at this point, but that's a different debate. I think, I don't have a good answer. You know, I walked into kind of a government office as economic advisor at the beginning of 1985. And, we still had stuff like chief controller of imports and exports. I remember myself and the famous Prannoy Roy, who's, of course, created NDTV, we were the two economic advisors, going to these meetings and discussing things like something, whether it should be on the restricted list or the limited permissible list or open general license and various other categories. I mean, we couldn't engage because our economics didn't allow us. But that's the edifice. I mean, one could always say, when in doubt, liberalize. And sometimes we did get out that point of view, and Rajiv Mishra, who was chief controller, I think, went along. But I mean, it was a different world. I think Martin can relate to that because he's perhaps in the late 70s talked to some of his interlocutors. But I have a feeling that by the mid 80s, things had got worse rather than better compared to the late 70s. I don't know. And it was very difficult to kind of, as he said, our policy was mad. I mean, in retrospect, clearly so, and people recognize it. But I think whether this was due to brainwashing, not brainwashing, how shall I say, the kind of socialism that was practiced, it was not true socialism, it was a socialism of a particular kind, and this sort of attempt at detailed control, but without sort of actually having the full discipline that goes along with it in a sort of early Soviet system. It was a very mixed up thing. So I guess what it taught me was that once you take a path of wrong policies, it's very difficult to get out of that path easily. I mean, voluntarily so. And I think subsequent history has also continued to show that. This last tranche drawdown, that I thought, you would know much more about this, NK, but I thought that was essentially because we knew we were going to reach the conditionalities on the fisc and the monetary. And by then, fortunately, our balance of payments, which was the pressure point, had already recovered sufficiently, thanks to our various opening up to foreign capital, private capital as well, not just the loans that we took. And growth had started. We thought we could manage. I mean, we'd had, that last tranche would just give us a few more months of support and a few $1 million. And I think the decision taken was the right one. You know, why get into the kind of, bad books of having broken conditionality when you could look kind of, how should I say, gracious and say, look, we don't need it. We'll do without it. Give it to some other poor country who needs it. And we'll manage. And I think that was the right call at that right time. I think in terms of policy conditionality that we did not perform on, other than the fiscal and monetary, which are the macro ones, I'm not aware that there were anything there which were deeply pending in you would know this, so please correct me, on the structural side.
There were quite a few, Shankar, but I think that since time is...
Yeah. But I mean, those in the time period, those would not have got done anyway. Even, so those were sort of longer term stuff, whether it was labor markets or this or that, anyway. So I think that was the right call from the short-term optics of it and the politics of it. Whether those few more months would have given us, labor market liberalization, I don't know. I mean, as I say, I don't have the full list in my mind in the way you do, so perhaps you can tell us. Now, on the cohesiveness of the team, of course, as you pointed out, that's just a case of where you were saying that that was very important. And I truly think that it is not just the cohesiveness of the team within the finance ministry, but across to other parts of the economic ministries, you know, Amarnath Verma, Rakesh Mohan in industry, and with the RBI, particularly Rangarajan and the group there, which I think helped us. And I do lament that that kind of, as far as I can tell, cohesiveness did not much survive the 1990s. And it makes, in my view, policy making so much more easier and so much quicker and adroit, and also easier to project to the outside world, whether they are domestic media or the external interlocutors. And I'm not sure that that has ever come back yet, but I may be wrong. The defense expenditure is a set of issues that's now coming up for some time, the ratio to GDP and all. I worry. And I think given that we live in a difficult neighborhood, I think I do worry. The only answer I can see is, of course, that either you have to grow faster so that there's more of a cake to share, or you have to bite some bullets, you know, whether it be increased taxation as a ratio to GDP, or cutting down so-called populist expenditure, you know, and these are not easy bullets to bite. But failing that, I don't see our necessary strengthening of strategic capability, but maybe I don't understand these things and perhaps I shouldn't talk more about them. I also have a gut feeling that in defense, instead of being one of the largest importers of defense equipment, we need to be self-reliant and you know, engage our domestic potential, domestic industries, which I think are now at a much more developed stage, given all that has happened in industry over the last 20 years. And one could have a viable private sector defense contracting business. And I believe this government has tried, but so far I'm not aware that it's really taken off, but I may be behind the times. On the government response to the pandemic, I think the last question here, the agenda ahead. But this is a matter of judgment. And I think, I mean, like you, I'm aware of the initiatives like in agricultural marketing, like in the labor codes and others that you mentioned that have been taken already by this government. But in some sense, and of course many others, IBC and the GST and things like that. But in some sense, some of these remain work in progress because they're tough things to do against the weight of burden of history. The politics remain naughty, shall we say. So it's not like where you change the exchange rate and stick to it, or you change the tariff structure and you stick to it. This is more process involved, more institutional change involved, makes it more difficult. And that is why I am perhaps less bullish on these things getting through. I mean, to take the example of the labor code, it's passed parliament, but the rules of those 4 codes have remained to be notified because they have to require something like unanimity with the states, so I'm told. And this is not an easy thing. That's just one example. The agriculture stuff, you know, has been caught up very badly in the politics. So this is perhaps why I'm less bullish that the outcome in terms of incomes, output, productivity that one expects from reforms, otherwise why do reforms, may be more elusive. And which is why, to go back to Martin's thoughts earlier, I guess I am a prisoner to the logic and the data.
Thank you. Thank you, Shankar.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya, for this detailed answer. Before I come to Mr. Singh to ask him one important question pertaining to your book. Let me make two quick points. One is that this India terminating the IMF arrangement is something which is not new. It's almost like part of India's DNA. In 1983, also something similar happened. India, the moment in 1983, after a larger IMF loan, that was an extended fund facility, India discontinued the arrangement the moment it got a little better. So I think what was happening in 1994 was probably something, taken out from what happened in 1983. I have one question that has come from one of the participants, Dr. Acharya, and I would request other participants also to send their questions. And this is a question from Mr. Jim Malcolmson, and he says, a voice from your past, from when we were graduate students at Harvard. Looking back from your current standpoint, what has been the most useful from what you were taught at Oxford and at Harvard in your giving economic advice? Dr. Acharya.
Oh gosh, that's a big one. I guess what is most useful is the training and, how shall I say, training makes it sound too technical, but more the whole business of learning with a skeptical mind. And that, you have to question things and then understand them and then question them again and hopefully understand them better. And always remain open to the other person's point of view, that he may actually know something more than you do. So I think these are things that come out of being in academic environments where questioning is part of the game. The technical tools, of course, one picks up, and they were well taught, particularly, I think, in Harvard, because that was more technically oriented. But I think it's more the overall that, don't take any professor at his face value. You just ask him.
That's right. That's right. I will come to Mr. Wolf in a minute. Mr. Singh, I have a question for you. You have read the book very carefully, it seems. And my question to you is this, that would you agree with Dr. Acharya's assessment of the finance ministers in his book? You also work with them, most of them. And Dr. Acharya actually ranked them, almost. So would you agree with his assessment of the finance ministers that you have worked with, from Manmohan Singh onwards?
So actually, Shankar is being audacious as he is with his clarity, has ranked the finance ministers. But frankly speaking, I had the privilege and pleasure of working with 3 finance ministers. About Dr. Manmohan Singh, there is no difference of opinion that he was a man of outstanding domain knowledge, great affection, warmth, analytical skills, and it's a great pleasure to work with him. Equally, I think that with Mr. Chidambaram, I did not find him arrogant. In fact, quite surprisingly, some of the important tax reforms, let us remember, were done by Mr. Chidambaram at that time. The famous great simplification of the tax, of the direct taxes, the so-called dream budget, was one of the features of Mr. Chidambaram's period. He hadn't opposed it, not that that necessarily was his first option, but I think in my relationship, certainly as a very brilliant lawyer, his opinions used to be crisp, sharp, and perhaps not as interactive. I mean, if one was wanting to find a parallel, having worked with Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Chidambaram immediately, you would have to adjust to a new world, or the Chidambaram matrix. And then I worked with Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who of course was had been a trained bureaucrat, with an IAS officer. He knew how to run departments. He very quickly grasped some of the intricate issues on the economic side. So it was a great pleasure for me to work with all of them. And the only disagreement that I have with Shankar is that, as far as I'm concerned, I found them all equally amiable and pleasant, and none of them in any way awkward in terms of the working relationship which I had.
Okay. Quickly, Dr. Acharya has a very interesting take on tax cuts.
Can I just chip in on this? Sorry,
sure, please.
Because I think one way, somebody watching this may run away with perhaps what I would think is a wrong impression from my perspective, and maybe it just shows that I had to be more careful when I write things. Martin always told me I should be, but I think the phrase I had used about Mr. Chidambaram in the book is someone who's often very charming and sometimes arrogant. So it's I don't think it was the idea. I certainly don't want it projected that arrogance was his primary characteristic, because that's not what I came away with either. But I don't think that it would be much disagreed with, on the other hand, by many people in today's India either. That is a little bit of a characteristic that he has. But
well, I mean, where I agree with you entirely is he was not amiable to persuasion. Once he had made up his mind, he could put forward that with a degree of impertinence and arrogance without engaging in greater discussion. This is something exactly that I have also written about him without using the word arrogant in my own book, Shankar, which you have kind enough to read, when I have described my relationship with all the three finance ministers. So that way we don't disagree too much.
And just to end the footnote that, I mean, I do begin by saying these are the three of the finest finance ministers we've ever had in entire history, one after another. And so, I mean, when I rank, or you say that I rank, it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee, so to speak. So we are choosing amongst the best. In fact, one of the interesting characteristics, comparing what's happened Manmohan Singh and after in finance ministers versus before, is, I mean, we haven't after that, I don't believe, had a finance minister who was not in some sense a professional. Had some strong professional background, whether it be law, whether it be civil services. In Manmohan's case, it was, of course, economics. Because, you think of Arun Jaitley, or you think of Mrs. Sitaraman, they're all come from the profession. This is very different from, say, my experience of the 80s, the few years that I was there. After VP Singh left, you had Mr. Y.B. Chavan, you had, S.B. Chavan, and N.D. Tiwari, who are essentially much more politicians, deeply so, rather than strong on a professional background. And I mean, I'm sure if you go back in history,
Shankar, can I add that I slightly disagree with you?
Okay.
I found both the finance ministers, Mr. Jaitley, who I found was one of the most amazing intellects you can come. He was, of course, also exceedingly sharp lawyer, and what he would understand something almost intuitively, complex issues, and come to the main point which required a decision. So, I mean, I found that his understanding was equally good. And I think about the present finance minister, since my direct dealings with her was the chairman of the Finance Commission, there were frequent interactions with her. I think that her understanding, contrary to her impression that she gives on many of these issues, is equally good. And I think that she's capable of understanding different points of view. She's reasonable. She's rational. Please see the budget. There are some very difficult decisions, Shankar, which she has taken. I mean, privatization of, maybe small, but privatization of two banks, works, no doubt in the works. Privatization, different mindset on public sector undertaking. These are some difficult decisions.
Absolutely. We will come back to this very interesting discussion. But Mr.
I just want to say that, okay, we don't disagree. My point was pre-Manmohan Singh and Manmohan Singh. You know, that is, we now seem to have a pattern that they're all professionals.
Mr. Wolf, you wanted to make a point. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think, though I have lots of views, I'm not going to get involved in the discussion of different Indian personalities, though, of course, I've known them all very well. Well, not very well, but I've known them all as a foreign journalist, very interested in this. I just have two very quick comments. The first one, which Shankar might want to talk about a bit more, seems to me central in his story of reform is the role of the PM and the capacity of the PM to support reform in different ways. That seems to me quite an important part of the story of the 90s. That's interesting because God knows it's pretty obvious that the present Prime Minister has the capacity to do this. The point I wanted to make is to pick up on NK's comments on why some people are not as optimistic as he is. And it is the point that Shankar makes repeatedly in the book, and he made it again today, which is, from my perspective as an outsider, it's shown in the data, both on policy and performance, India is deglobalizing in trade. And it's deglobalizing in trade. Look at its decision not to join RCEP. Very significant. At a time when the world is deglobalizing. Now, that's really important because I don't believe that it will be possible for India to sustain growth of 8%, something like that, if exports don't grow at least that fast. In a diversifying economy, the alternative, if exports don't grow that fast, that means import substitution increases constantly. And we know the costs of that. For exports to grow at 8% at least, that means they will have to grow about 2.5 times as fast as the world economy. And probably twice as fast as world trade. That won't happen in this context. It just won't happen. And in that case, that I think is potentially a binding constraint on India's growth. And that's why openness, or part of why openness is so important. I would be interested in Shankar's view on that.
Well, let me first answer the first question, try and answer the first question you just put. The role of the Prime Minister in our system. And I have to say that I have to limit my comments to those that I saw from within the government. It's very difficult to be an outsider and talk very kind of sensibly about this, I think. I mean, I think we were blessed with those two prime ministers, Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee. We were, and I say this somewhere in my book, perhaps page 181, if I'm to remember rightly, that they were both, I think, absolutely invaluable to India's economic policy and reform story. Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee. Sorry, there's an echo.
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
I think Mr. Singh may have two connections on NK. If you could switch off one of them, the echo will stop.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think I think Mr. Rao's leadership was crucial in making that break from the pre-91 madness, as Martin calls it, to something much more economically sensible. And that was absolutely crucial. And his empowering of Dr. Manmohan Singh to go ahead most of the time with the things that he actually did to get done between 91 and 96. Where I've compared the two prime ministers, not compared, but I've mentioned them in the same breath later in page 181 and said something to the effect that perhaps Mr. Bajpai, who also presided over a lot of very good, strong reforms, no time now to list them all, but where I think perhaps his political adroitness, and I must emphasize that I'm talking about his political adroitness, was even greater, was because he was operating without the benefit, if you like, of urgency of a crisis. And secondly, that he had to operate with a far less cohesive coalition than Narasimha Rao. So I think given that, the great deal of reform that got done during those 6 years is much to the credit of Mr. Bajpai as PM. And together, I think the important point is the two together, with the 2 years in between when you had different kind of PMs in between, but basically the 13 years that between 91 and 2004, those two prime ministers gave a direction and continuity and cohesion to sound economic policy and reforms that was, I think, invaluable. Whether it was enough, whether it could have been better, those are different stories.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Acharya. Thank you very much for this answer. And let me, we are running out of time. Let me sum up some of the questions that have come up already. And I will place them before you. The number one question is that there's a question that is on, is there a turn back in terms of economic policies which are in the name of self-reliance? Is there an attempt to go back in a certain sense, like Asian economies? We probably are no longer looking at opening up our trade policies. So that is one. The second question is, would you like to detail why you think 5% GDP growth is more likely and than less? And the third question is coming from the guest faculty, which is that what are the things young economists should keep in mind while pursuing professional life in academic and policy making?
Sorry, you want me to try something at this?
Yeah, please. And,
okay,
and
I think because we are running out,
you can all chip in whenever
okay.
you want to. Yeah.
Very quickly, I think in this area, foreign trade policy, I think since approximately 2017, there has been a little bit turning back of the clock, and I think that's not helping us overall in terms of our policies. So I hope, but there are, I think, straws in the wind which suggests that might change, the kind of more openness to FTAs and so on and so forth. Let's see. Secondly, why do I expect, this is only for 5 years ahead, and I'm not giving a long-term thing, I don't know. But post-pandemic 5 years, that is from 2022 to 2027, let's say, I would be pleasantly surprised if our average growth rate turns out to be more than 5%, and genuinely pleasantly surprised. But as to why, well, that's a long story. And I think I would request you to read the book, and some of the answer is there, and also in my other writings. And third, advice to the young economist, I think always through centuries remains the same. Keep an open mind, think hard, study hard, look at what the great economists had to say on some of these issues in writing over the decades and centuries, and look at reality.
Mr. Singh, would you like to respond to some of the questions? And I would add one more question of mine, which is that why do you think that the kind of team building that we saw among economists and economic advisors that we saw in the late 1980s, we no longer seem to be seeing? We are not replicating that same spirit of team building where at one point in time you have got so many, as a band of strong economic advisors giving their views and analysis to the government. Why is it that we don't seem to be getting the same teams of same caliber coming forward? What could be the reason? Yeah, if you could add.
You want me to respond briefly?
Yeah, sure.
So on the first question, which is the trade question, I agree with Shankar that one mustn't overlook the straws in the wind, and also the fact that, Shankar, you have yourself correctly pointed out that there are distinct areas like the defense, where the concept of Atmanirbhar does not really in any way contradict the need to pursue open trade policies. The one is not a contradiction of the other. In fact, that the Prime Minister has reiterated many times that achieving productivity, overall efficiency of the economy will really enhance our export capability and will really also enhance the Atmanirbhar concept. So I agree that the two are not necessarily asymmetrical and can be pursued simultaneously. On team building, Ashok.
Yeah.
A very difficult question. One of the reasons, let me begin, and Shankar, don't mind my being a little provocative and complimentary to the tribe of economists, of which you are among the favorites. Part of the reason, Ashok, is we do not have continuity in the office of the Chief Economic Advisor. That unlike the distinguished predecessors that have been, from Ram Honawar, Dr. I.G. Patel, to Vimal Jalan, to Shankar Acharya, there has been a degree of continuity in the office of the Chief Economic Advisor, who is a factor which glues together. After all, there are 3 departmental secretaries, and there used to be. Now, of course, 1 or 2 banking has become separate, and also disinvestment and so on. But there used to be basically 3 secretaries in the department: the expenditure, revenue, and economic affairs. The glue which was cemented them was the continuity in the office of the Chief Economic Advisor. And I have unhesitatingly, Ashok, commented on this in my own book to say that there is great value in long-term continuity, which will strengthen the quality of the economic inputs, which go not only in the economic survey, but in the entire budget-making process.
I hope the government is listening. Mr. Wolf, if I heard you correctly, you said that the world is not globalizing anymore. It is pulling down shutters. In that kind of a scenario, India not opening up, is that something that bothers you? That is number one. And number two is, would you agree with Dr. Acharya's grim analysis and prospects for the Indian economy?
Well, as I've said already earlier, I've discovered over the last 25 years that whenever I've disagreed with Shankar, usually by being more optimistic, I was wrong and he was right. And since he spends a lot more time looking at the Indian economy, it will be completely ridiculous for me to say that he is wrong. I think he's more likely to be right than wrong on the record, on his record. And so I don't think I have anything to contribute on that whatsoever. I think it's a good starting point. And what has happened over the last 5-10 years in policy and performance, it seems to me absolutely consistent with his view that the days of 7-8% are not there now. We hope they will be. I hope they will be. I want India to succeed very much for many reasons, but the most important being, brought out beautifully by Shankar, India suffers from enormous problems. Of the most important that he discusses, which we haven't discussed, is what he describes as a brutal employment crisis. I mean, he describes it with immense power. On the other question, yes, my view is that an economy cannot prosper in isolation. India tried that quite hard. And even quite a large economy, and it's not that large an economy, remember, the demand at home isn't large enough. It has to exploit world trade very, very significantly and needs to do so for a long period. This is getting harder, not because deglobalization is yet dramatic. But we've now lived already a long period when broadly world trade has grown in line with world GDP instead of faster. And we are seeing a very considerable growth of tension, which may create opportunities, but well as problems in relations between the US and China, which might create some very painful choices, though perhaps less so for India. This being so, in this context, my view is that India's efforts to promote its trade and to become an efficient and competitive producer becomes more important, not less. And because of the relations between the US and China, there ought to be opportunities for India in the world economy, which were not there 10 years ago, and they should be exploited. So I really do think, and I'm saying this without in any way denying, of course, there are strategic sectors in which a degree of self-sufficiency is appropriate, though again, the costs have to be borne in mind. I wouldn't suggest you're going for self-sufficiency in nuclear aircraft carriers. But this being so, yes, I do think that I don't believe India will sustain 7 or 8% growth without exports growing at least that fast for many reasons. And that means you're going to have to grow trade 2.5 times as fast as the world economy. And that won't happen without improving competitiveness. I mean, it's as simple as that. And policy needs to be looked at from that point of view. And I am concerned, final point, sorry, I'm going on, that there is an impulse towards more self-sufficiency, nothing like as foolish as, of course, in the 70s. I'm not comparing it, but I think it's the wrong direction. As I suggested, there are big opportunities for India in the world. The West wants a close relationship with India.
I think that should be the message. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. I think we have come to the close of this discussion. If I may, and before I hand it over to Dr. Mishra, Dr. Acharya, would you like to have a final closing comment on your book or anything? If you want to have it, please go ahead. Otherwise, I will hand it back to Dr. Mishra.
Well, I would just request all of you who haven't to take a peep at the book. That's all.
So, here is the book. Yeah, that's it. Dr. Mishra, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. I think I have to just pass it on to Pramod, who is our chairman of the board for ICRIER. And actually, Pramod was supposed to give the opening remarks and I was supposed to close, but we swapped our places. So over to Pramod.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you very much, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be able to do this last round. It's been a wonderful, fascinating discussion. I think in many cases, it's talking about historical facts which take us back and have led to such an enormous development of India that it's actually indescribable. And I'll talk about it from my vantage point because I'm a beneficiary of it in ways perhaps that are accidental, but also wonderful. Shankar, thank you for being a part of ICRIER for so long, for still being there. You're a wonderful support for us. Every time I think about what a great organization ICRIER is, and I keep remembering that Shankar is our visiting professor, sits at our offices from time to time in Habitat, and that in itself makes us feel very proud and feel very encouraged. I really mean that, Shankar. It's always been a privilege. You know, a lot of people have talked about economics and the economists. All of you obviously would do that. I'll talk about something else. And to me, there are 3 big themes which I loved about the book. I'll do my marketing pitch for the book for you, Shankar. It's wonderfully well written. It's a great woven network of family, memoirs, travel, work, chance, jobs, everything else. And it's written so that you can read it with great speed. It's not written in the way I thought an economist would write it. I will tell you that because I've read articles by economists which are entirely incomprehensible to lay people like me, but it's written beautifully and written quite wonderfully. But what comes through to me most of all is really 3 different elements. One, that you represented the best idea of India in my regard from an outsider's perspective. The idea of experts, of brilliant, eminent experts working across governments with longevity and driving reforms and driving things for the benefit of India with a level of experience that was unparalleled. I pray, I worry that will that get repeated again? Of course, we have many eminent people. NK, yourself, Montek, A.N. Verma, lots of people who were architects. And you are all the creators of history. I don't say this to praise anyone unnecessarily, but I wonder if you realize how much history all of you have created. Montek, for the work he did. By the way, when I was a fledgling cowboy here from the US, after having done leverage buyouts on Wall Street, all of you were amongst the first to give us an approval to set up GE Capital. And that's how I started my career. And those were heady days of economic reforms, of tremendous excitement, of walking into offices. NK, I walked into yours, you won't remember that, walking into offices like yours and Montek's and A.N. Verma's and everybody else, and thinking, my God, India is changing, and what an exciting place it was. And Shankar, we met at that time also. And for us, I will tell you from the outside, this was easily the most exciting place on earth. And I don't know that India will ever see such momentous expression or such momentous time, as you mentioned that, Shankar, from an economic perspective. But along with that, you talk about two things which I love. One is chance and circumstance and how that shapes our lives, no matter how carefully we calibrate them, and how history changes the course of our lives. From Indira Gandhi to many other events to meeting many people. Throughout that, it's all up to all of us. And we don't know where it will take us, but that recognition that we have to grab hold of chance and circumstance, I think, plays through so wonderfully well. Two, critical decisions. The third part, critical decisions. Critical choices, turning down bricks. I can't believe you turned down the role of Apu for Satyajit Ray. I mean, really, come on, Shankar, please.
My parents.
Your parents did, but imagine where that might have led to. But going through being asked to work with the government again, turning that down, making those critical decisions is just as important, I think, in all our lives, and a lesson for everyone who reads the book. And lastly, your point about holding some firmly held beliefs. One, that you have only one life to lead. And second, that a variety of lived experiences contributes to a more fulfilled life. You say it so simply, and yet it is so vital and important to all our lives. And the quote I love from Alexander the Great, you have to live this life both as if you will live forever and die tomorrow. And you're right, we don't take the latter part seriously, but perhaps as we all get older, we should. I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Martin, NK, you people are always brilliant, always insightful. Ashok, for such a wonderful, erudite way of pulling this interview together. To the publishers, and of course to Deepak, who's the director at ICRIER. I am privileged to be able to associate with all of you, and this has been a wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
With that, I'll turn it back. I think we can bring this to a close right now, right? Deepak? Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.